Welcome to Hack Your Hascom. Today's guest is Bruce Donato, and he is a principal with K&A First Aid and Safety, providing safety consulting and emergency preparedness services for many industries. He holds a BSc in chemical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania and has over 40 years of industrial experience. He has worked in the federal government and for chemical, textile, and biotechnology companies, including DuPont and Life Technologies. Mr. Donato is a certified safety professional, certified hazardous materials manager, a qualified environmental professional, and certified ergonomics compliance director. He has held positions as a design engineer, plant supervisor, research engineer, distribution manager, laboratory supervisor, and facilities manager. Mr. Donato has presented short courses, platform presentations, and webinars for various nonprofit organizations focusing on compliance, training, emergency response, and all aspects of environmental health and safety. And recently, Mr. Donato has been training EHS professionals on the confusion around understanding of safety data sheets, from inaccuracies to comprehension and ambiguity in the regulations. Welcome, my friend. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Atano?
I'm I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for joining me. And over the years we've had some excellent lively debates on several topics that relate to safety data sheets in the real world and what you do when you're actually in the trenches fighting for compliance. So we thought today would be a great time to talk about these sorts of, you know, fights that we have. I'll put in quotes in the trenches. So I want to thank you for again joining. So let's get into this here. Let's talk about SDSs, safety data sheets. We get a lot of questions and concerns about, are they really required for everything that we need to do for shipping and chemicals? Like talk a little bit about what we see there.
I always love that question. And I'll say this multiple times probably as we go through this. My favorite answer to a question is, it depends. And between you and me, that's always a running joke. So, people say, somebody wants an SDS for this product, it's non hazardous. Do I need it? My answer is no, but you may want to do it anyways just because it's easier to do it that way. There are, if it's non hazardous, you don't need a safety data sheet. There also are other exemptions, such as if it falls under the auspices of another regulatory body, such as the EPA, DOT, ECTA, CPSC, REACH. They all have their own requirements, and some say we don't need an SDS or not. The EPA is a great one, is that if you're regulated by the EPA, you do not need a safety data sheet. If you're regulated by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, you're an article, you don't need a safety data sheet. So I'm probably jumping ahead for that. We'll talk about it. Is that what do you do if somebody says, "Hey, I want a safety data sheet and I'm selling you water"? Give them one. It's I have fought that battle for 30 years, and it's not worth the fight. Just use a standard template that is not regulated, and create that safety data sheet.
Yeah, I think a lot of times I find too is, in my world, I get clients that are like, I need to sell something, and the first thing they ask me is, I need an SDS, right? And it's almost like checking a box, regardless of if they need it or not. And when I get that, I typically try to explain ahead of time, here are the regulations, requirements. Sometimes you can gauge whether or not that client understands this fact, and really all they want is to get this off their table, right? So in that case, when the client asks for the SDS and it's not required, what kind of answer what do you do in those circumstances?
Well, it depends upon the industry and what's going on. Recently, I've picked up a lot of OTC, over the counter type pharmaceuticals, and these are products that been around for 30, 40 years, and they come to me because someone writes a safety data sheet that makes it sound like your ears are going to fall off if you use it the wrong way. And they say, do I need it? And it's like, no, but we can create one and you use the data that you have, and you can show that it's hazardous or non-hazardous, and it's not technically an OSHA SDS. It follows all the protocols that OSHA says, but it's not required by OSHA, and it makes people happy. The one of the fun things about doing OTC products is you have all this data that they did for toxicology study, and what they're looking for is effectiveness. No observable effect level, NOEL, and then they're looking for when they're killing people, but they don't have the real data that you want for OSHA, which is hazard data. So that's just one area that becomes fascinating. The other is you're dealing with something that is, I'll stay with biotech now. I just had this the past week. We have this product, we're going to put it out there, and I just gone through with them of all of their shipping requirements, and they're all exempt, and it's non-hazardous. And even though it's human sourced, it's like, one, it's a biologic, it doesn't need a safety data sheet, and two, it's non-hazardous. So we just create it, and now we're going to ship it with the product. With an article, it's I've written safety data sheets for. I didn't do it, but it's something like almost as simple as a hammer. It's a physical piece of something. It's not even a chemical. Do it. That's all I can say. I have fought that battle too many times, and you just go with it.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, I get that too. The article thing is always, again, when you have a customer client that wants that, you almost can't get around it. At least from my point of view, what I try to do is get the word out, describe what does OSHA define as an article. Bring some examples, let them know that this could apply to what you're doing here. And again, they insist, well, Amazon's calling me and Walmart needs this. And again, Amazon and Walmart, you don't know on the other end what they're doing. They've got a checkbox that they got to go to, or they'll say, if you don't give me this, you can't sell to us. So obviously they want to sell. So, at least we did our due diligence. We explained to them what a article is or what a biological is and why you don't need one, but they insist, and I agree. Just make one, and at least give them the paperwork that they can get that check box checked.
Yeah, it's not related to safety data sheets, but a lot of companies are using this large company to do, here's an evaluation of all your documents, what do you do, and things like that. And I'm getting into the point that I'm making things up that aren't relevant. Have a company that has less than 10 employees, no company vehicles, and I have to write in the procedures their driver safety program. There is no difference between this and having to do an SDS. And I like your analogy. The large companies are just mandating this, and the smaller companies have to do it, and you don't have a choice, even though it doesn't apply. So don't fight it, is what I would say.
Yeah, great point. So you mentioned earlier about ECHA, which is the European Chemical Agency that handles chemicals safety over there. Do you ever get the need for a separate SDS for Europe in what you do?
Well, I find Europe an interesting way of discussing it is you have to look at it coming from Europe, going to Europe. The coming from Europe is easy. We joke about the global harmonization system, and that harmonized worldwide. So what does OSHA do? They start out with HNOC, hazards not otherwise classified. Combustible dust is an example of that. So I have a SDS from Europe, and I look, does it address the add-ons that are not harmonized, with the United States? And it's most of the time it's fine, but I don't arbitrarily accept that. I have a client that does ink, and they have a lot of dyes coming in. That one I have to look at very carefully because they seem to miss certain things when they're shipping from Europe over here. The In terms of shipping it over to Europe, I use you. Seriously, it's there. You can only learn so many regulations and different things, and I'll look at it and say, "Hey, is this correct?" And there, when I have an expert, I go to them, and you are that expert, so that's why I'll go to you on that.
Okay. Yeah, it's and that's the thing. When you said earlier about harmonized and the three letters in the acronym G, H, and S, I tend to joke the G is actually more generally harmonized versus globally, and that it kind of makes sense. As you probably know, the GHS was made as a building block, right? So you're supposed to take an off-the-shelf kind of, let's call it a program, the GHS rules and regulations, and kind of adapt them to your already existing plan and program or adoption of those, depending on what country you're in. So, this is why you have these little bit of gaps in what could be, which could be the other G in GHS. So,
Well,
there's a lot there.
yeah, I also get a kick out of the word harmonize. If you look at the Hispanic languages and you ask them, what does harmonize mean? In general, it tends to translate into being able to dance together. And there really isn't a great translation if you try to use the word harmonize. If you use the word uniform, that translates much better. So I always got a kick out of the fact that the United Nations came up with an acronym that for probably 25% of the people using it, it doesn't translate. So
Right, right.
I'm sorry, that's just a personal pet peeve of mine is, the general harmonized, I'm being sufficient, facetious there, but generally harmonized system isn't that harmonized.
Right, exactly. And that's why, I mean, I too get customers that are like, I want, I'm shipping all over the world. Can't I just have one SDS? No, not necessarily. It's going to cause more confusion and generally than not. So you need a specific, from port to port, like you mentioned earlier, going from the US to an EU port, in transit, the US sheet is all the way good till that you hit that port in Europe. And now once you take that container off that ship, what do you do next? You have to comply to the European member state, perhaps.
And something you and I haven't talked about ever, I don't think, is you have certain information that you might need in the United States, and it's no big deal. But when you're going through customs and you use a certain word, you have to be very careful of that. I find this in ideological agents of shipping them, that I have to be very careful of the words I use to get through customs, because what you have for REACH, what you have for OSHA's HAZCOM, okay, may not be any big deal, but customs in each country, there are certain flags that they look for. So, it's kind of funny. It's not just, meeting the requirements that we're trying to do for REACH or OSHA.
Right, right. Many other aspects that come creeping in. So, like you said, there's many different, the world of chemicals and what is required to be complied with. Do you have any issues, or I'm sure you do, with pesticides and some background on that?
Pesticides are one of my favorites. Uh, Going back decades ago, the way the regulations were written and the laws were written, the difference between the regulation and the law, OSHA was created under a law, an act, and they write regulations. EPA was also created that way, but EPA has several laws that they have to follow: Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, the what's called FIFRA, Fungicide, Insecticide, whatever, Rodenticide Act kind of thing. And pesticides fall, excuse me, fall under the FIFRA law. And so what that said was labels had to say everything about the safety of that pesticide. And the labels had to be approved by the EPA. And if you ever go to the EPA and look at these submissions, they actually have the physical label there. If you work in the drug industry, FDA does the exact same thing. You have to have a label that is approved. And so That's what was done, and EPA said, we don't care about safety MSDSs back then. Probably in the last decade or so, because people kept asking for safety data sheets for pesticides, even though they did not apply, the EPA and OSHA decided to talk some, and the EPA said, we will approve an SDS that meets the OSHA requirements, but they want to see that it meets their requirements too. So you can actually have a safety data sheet that the EPA accepts and that meets the OSHA requirements. So, summarizing that, technically you do not need a safety data sheet for a pesticide unless EPA has said, yes, you're going to create a safety data sheet that meets these requirements. So any of the older pesticides are not going to have anything like that. Where do you go if you want to know what's going on legally? You go to the label, you don't go to the safety data sheet. This past week, I had a question, and it was a disinfectant, and very well known disinfectant, and it had it as an RTU, ready to use. And they gave me the safety data sheet, and you look at the disposal, and they, want to send it off as, significant hazardous waste. You go to the label, and it says you can dispose of in the sanitary sewer. And it's like, which one is correct? The label is going to be correct. And this product is widely used. It's used, in laboratories. It's used in cleaning companies. And what are the, cleaning companies cannot send the, cleaning solutions to hazardous waste every time. It has to be designed for going down the drain. And practicality has to come into everything we deal with.
Okay. Lots to consider. There are some complexities, but sounds like there's an agency precedent there versus OSHA, EPA, kind of kingdoms that rule in their jurisdictions. That says a lot, especially with SDSs. You'll notice that there are sections that OSHA says they're non-mandatory, and I believe the EPA parts of it are falls under one of those. I think that's a great example of where one ends and the other begins. So again, when OSHA adopted parts of the GHS in 2012, you notice several products have become corrosive. For example, soaps. Would you want to comment on that?
Actually, I had one other comment.
Sure.
The pesticides.
Hmm.
Um, People. One of the things that came out of the pandemic, and I had lots of arguments with industrial hygienists that were experts,
Hmm.
and they did not recognize that any disinfectant was regulated by the EPA. If you claim that something kills bacteria, stops viruses, whatever, that is a disinfectant, you have to register it with the EPA. And bleach would be an example of this. And so if it says that it kills bacteria, viruses, germs, it's a disinfectant. That goes under the EPA regulation. If the bleach says we're here just for whitening and cleaning, they actually can sell it under Consumer Product Safety Commission. So that it does not need a safety data sheet under either of those. Do you see safety data sheets for bleach? Yes. Okay, they're usually
Yes.
very good. Something else that this it's amazing what happened since we talked about having this podcast. But a week or two ago, someone asked me how to dispose of a disinfectant, and I said, "Can you send me the label?" And I look at it, and it says stops bacteria growth, mold growth, all the things that make it a disinfectant. I'm looking all over. There is no EPA registration number on it. It never
Hmm.
was registered with the EPA. And it was like, you have to look for this too. And so technically, they're selling something illegally. Until they say that it's a pesticide, disinfectant, they're covered under HASCOM. So you get into you talk about trenches. That was a new one for me that I actually had that. So now You asked about the
Corrosive
change,
soaps
yeah,
and
the change. And one of the things that I noticed in 2012 when OSHA adopted the part of the GHS, I forget which revision number it was, the definition of corrosive said if it's irritating to the eyes, you need a corrosive label on it. You agree? Okay. So, and you've got soap in your eyes. It hurts. So guess what? It ends up being corrosive. Now, I deal a lot with what we call the building services industry. You might call them janitors, cleaning crews. And I'm, training on HAZCOM, and they're looking at these. Hey, what happened to our product? It has this corrosive label on it. Am I going to die from it? Am I allowed to get it on my hand? And it became an issue, and it came down to look at the safety data sheet, look at what does it say, why is it corrosive, and one of my take home messages always when I'm talking about confusion about safety data sheets, ask somebody that knows. It's I have lots of pet peeves on safety data sheets, as you know,
uh,
and one of them is very few people can understand safety data sheets like you or I do, and we have a hard enough time with it. How do we expect the general public to understand? And worse, that I'm getting concerned about is environmental health and safety professionals don't understand. And
right.
so, when you talk about looking at the label, understand what it means. You mentioned the corrosive label. There's also your exclamation point. And I tell people, don't say it means it's an irritant. Yeah, it can be. But there are 5 other things listed under there. My favorite is it's a narcotic. I'm going to get high from it. And I have products like that I see that the exclamation point's on there because it's a narcotic and it has nothing to do with being an irritant. So you do need to have both.
And that's where training and communicating come in. Ultimately, this is about hazard communication. So, great point on that and understanding. And like you said, industrial hygienists, people in our field, it's great to have more classes or get-togethers on, and I believe you've done these in the past, understanding safety data sheets. You've got many of them coming up. I applaud people like you doing this out in the real world because this makes a big world of difference. Ultimately, I think when GHS first came out, there was an issue with comprehension, understanding. I believe these regulations back in 2012 were made so that a fifth grader, your typical line worker, maybe of that level of education, are they going to understand? Hence the pictograms, hence the symbology used in the programs. You want to right away the see on an SDS be those pictograms, at least telling you of the kind of very useful.
Yeah, I could talk a lot about my issues with pictograms, but
Yeah, maybe a future podcast. I'd love to talk about that someday too. So, we have, you mentioned real early on is, do we need an SDS for water? And talk some more about that sort of situation.
do we legally need it? No.
No.
Do we have it? Yes. It just goes back down to don't fight it, do it. What I have found very useful about the water SDS is it gets to explain to people just because there's an SDS does not mean that it's hazardous.
Right.
And water is a great example of understanding if it's hazardous, it has to have an SDS. If it has an SDS, does not mean that it's hazardous. It goes one way, not the other. And that's probably one of the best things about having a water SDS.
And I think it's useful too. You probably can get into the weeds on how good an SDS is for something like water, especially like in a first aid section. You might see something like, if on skin, wash with soap and water. Well, isn't the product water to begin with?
Well, you know my favorite safety data sheet. There's laboratory soap. and from a very well known distributor. It's their brand of soap, and it says, in case of contact with skin, wash thoroughly with soap and water. And accuracies, inaccuracies, and safety data sheets are an issue. Some become very conservative and think that your right ear is going to fall off during a full moon. And others don't tell you really what the hazard is. I'd worked for a biotech company and we had this product that had three hazardous components in it. And when I left and I started looking at it, 5, 10 years later, they took off one of the hazardous components that I knew was still in there. And it's like you can go either way, too conservative, too liberal, and both are wrong. Both get people hurt. So it's there. There are mistakes in safety data sheets. Personally, I like looking at the raw data that's in certain sections like the LD50, the pH, and things like that. So it's not easy to understand a safety data sheet.
Absolutely. Great. And related to that, in the past we've used and currently still do certain rating systems such as the NFPA and HMIS, which uses 0 to 4 in their system, with 0 being no hazard. In GHS, it goes the opposite way, going from 5 to 1, with 5 being no hazard. Care to comment on confusion there?
Okay, NFPA, National Fire Protection Association, they are protecting firefighters. And back, I think it was even in the 50s, I know it was in the 60s, they came up with the red, blue, yellow diamond system with a white diamond at the bottom for special hazards. And 0 in the United States meant no big deal. Okay, we can deal with that. 4 would be high. And even in biosafety, you have biosafety levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1 being lower hazard than 4. So for decades, the United States knew about 0 not a hazard, 4 significant hazard. HIMAS, Hazardous Materials Identification System, was created by the National Coatings Association. It used to be called National Paint Association when it was developed. And they were very similar in the two rating systems. The one slight difference was the health hazard. Is firefighters cared about what degradation products were when something was on fire. HIMAS was under normal circumstances. So for the most part, they overlap. Now the white might say no water in the NFPA system. Firefighters like their hoses in water. Okay. The white section in the HIMAS system was more a custom, especially for the paint industry. What kind of personal protective equipment do you need? And they gave these letters A through L, and then you could customize it. And these were what we've known for ages. Now we go to the GHS. They don't even use 0. It's 5 to 1. Okay? And we train people to look at labels 0 to 4. GHS doesn't even require the hazard category to be on the label. So now I look at a safety data sheet and I see a hazard category, and it's not only reversed, it's not even the same numbers. How do you explain this to people? And I do webinars and for environmental health and safety people and ask surveys, what's the difference? And it amazes me how many people think that GHS is 4 to 0. And they don't even, they know it's reversed. They just don't know the numbers. So if I can't get safety people to know, how am I going to get other people to know? And just a little bit of history on that, and you know this better than most. People think that the GHS didn't like the United States and it was just purely about safety data sheets. It's actually much larger than that. And it was with the United Nations. The United States just chose not to participate until later on. And by then, they started using what Europe Europe are transportation use, where low number meant high hazard. And even in Department of Transportation, you'll see that that is much more aligned with the GHS and always has been than something like safety data sheets. So there is a history of why it was that way. And the US was just too late to put any input in to say, we go 0 to 4 while you guys go 5 to 1.
Great, great. Yeah, and I think that continues to be, taught, and I agree. Firefighters still live by that in what they do in their response. They're always looking for that diamond on
Yeah.
the warehouse wall.
And talking to the NFPA, they said, look, we created this for firefighters. People started using it for labeling packages. We're not changing ours. This is what firefighters know. And that's why they didn't
Right.
change. When the National Fire Protection Association chose not to change, the National Coatings Association, I think, followed suit. However, they did change their yellow into, from reactivity to physical hazard, I believe is what the
Mm.
term was. I always have to look that one up.
Well, great. Thanks for that one. And related somewhat, emergency response. So the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, or EPCRA, typically requires SDSs that are given to either local emergency or state emergency response groups. Is this practical, in your opinion?
Okay, so you have EPRA, the overreaching EPA regulation for the local emergency planning committee and the state emergency response commission. The LEPCs in a state report up to the CERC. Now, the CERC doesn't necessarily get these safety data sheets, but you have the local, in Maryland where I live, it's all by county. And so you have the county fire rescue, and they're supposed to have all these safety data sheets for all these companies that they, theoretically would have a binder, that goes with them when they're going to a hazmat response. And you look at this, and where I live, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology is here at NIST, and every year they submit their chemical inventory. They have something like 10,000 different chemicals. I'm not sure that you could fit the firefighter in the binders in with this. And I, I, I am the vice chair of the local emergency planning committee here, and talking with the hazmat fire chief, he's going, I don't want that. Maybe I'll take it electronically now that we can have it. But he never wanted that, even before they were electronic. And he goes, what I want is for the facility to have it. So while the law says you have to do this, and theoretically you give it there, give it to the LAPC, the practical aspect is you might give it to them electronically, but have it there that you can pull it out very quickly and know where they're at, where these hazardous chemicals are on your site, where the emergency is, and be prepared to give it to the incident commander when they come in to say, here's what's going on.
Okay.
There we go.
Excellent point there. What issues with, yes.
There we go.
Okay. OSHA DOT were labeled similar to a pictogram. Is a pictogram not required? Any concern?
Okay, so I think I understood your question, even though you're breaking up a little bit there. The pictograms were not designed to be DOT labels or placards. And when you ship something, you have to meet all the DOT requirements. And this has been an area of contention among my peers, our peers, is can you put the pictogram on it? And what I tend to say is on the outer shipping container, don't put the pictograms on, okay, unless it is the final package that's going to the end user. All right. If there's an internal package, do not put the pictograms on the outside. Depending upon who the DOT compliance officer is, they may decide to cite you for things that are distracting, let's call it that, from your shipping labels and placards and things like that. Colleagues that I highly respect will say, oh, it's easier just to put it all on, that way you cover everything. Remember, too much information can be as confusing as too little information.
Sure,
So
sure.
my opinion is do what the OT says, do what your carrier says, and try not to be confusing.
And I know now, as of the recording of this podcast, we are in transition from HCS 2012, I'm sorry, HCS 2015, which is when it was adopted here in the US, the Hazard Communication Standard, to the HCS 2024. So there has been talk, and OSHA has kind of said, well, we'd like to see that OSHA label regardless. They want to play nicely with DOT. They did say, in attending some of those initial talks when they rolled out the HCS 2024, they did promise that there would be some letters of interpretation, guidance documents. So I think keep on the lookout for that. It is part of this transition that OSHA does want to keep you informed about their latest interpretation, what they've seen in the last 12, 15 years of compliance to the new GHS HCS standard. So keep an eye for that for the latest updates on letters of interpretation. So I think that's something we need to talk about here. The website, OSHA website, does have a lot of good information for that if you're looking for letters of interpretation. Certainly, some of the best and very epic debates we've had are pharmaceuticals. What are some general guidelines with how these things intertwine with the world of what we do? FDA, DOT, OSHA, EPA, you name the gamut, and what it means to pharmaceutical world.
I like how you changed it from arguments to debates. So when you started out with the introductory comments. So certain places are very clear. You think about a pharmaceutical being regulated by the FDA. They're going to regulate the process, that they have a CGMP, current good manufacturing practices, that they're repeatable, they're clean, those kinds of things. And yes, the process is, but the chemicals themselves, and quite often pharmaceuticals are extremely hazardous. They are still regulated by HAZCOM. The workers are being exposed. Where I get into an interesting dilemma, and this is a very, very gray area, is what is the regulation when the exposure is not there because everything is in a closed system. So to keep things clean, quite often everything is done and there is no employee exposure. And again, people say, well, what about if the gasket blows or this, that, or the other? And it's like, fine, that's emergency response. I don't have to prepare you for the overexposure for an emergency. I have to tell you what to do in the emergency, that if this happens, get your butt out of there. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So where when I have those systems, I'm saying, look, you're not exposing anybody there, so we're not worried about the exposure aspect. However, my question comes up is, what are you doing about maintenance? Now, you can have a CIP, clean in place, program in place, and everything goes through, and then you're worried about hazardous waste and things like that. Or if you're opening it up, then HAZCOM definitely applies. So again, it depends. Now, you and I, one of our favorite debates, as you call it, is talking about compounding pharmaceutical labs, or pharmacies, I should say. And they have a hazardous component and they're mixing it up with water or whatever. And while they're handling it, it's hazardous. It's not a final product. Yes, it's still regulated by the FDA, but it is an employee exposure. That one is definitely covered under HAZCOM. Now, once it's in its final product, it's in the container. If you've ever used Cipro, if you ever have a little kid, you've always used Cipro. And you go into the pharmacy and they take the powder, they put it into the water, shake it up and give it to you because it does degrade in the water and you only have a short period of time to use it. Once it's in that package, it's purely regulated by the FDA and it would be exempt from HAZCOM, is my opinion. You may have a difference of opinion. What about pills? Okay. are the components can be hazardous, and yes, you have to deal with that while you're making it. But now they go to the pharmacy, not a compounding pharmacy, your regular pharmacy, and they're counting out the pills. This is regulated by the FDA. And yeah, what happens if they, stand on their right foot during a solar eclipse? They open their mouth and pour 100 tablets down their throat and they're being overexposed. Let's do a real risk assessment. And when people say, well, what if, what if? Yeah, go back to your fundamentals of risk assessment of acceptable risk, unacceptable risk. And people often don't understand we need to get to an acceptable risk as opposed to no risk. I when I talk about risk assessment to people all the time, I ask, when you come to work, should you have no risk about being exposed? They say, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And then I ask, do you drive your car? Yeah. Do you have any risk? Yeah. Well, why are you taking a risk driving a car and you expect no risk at work? Acceptable risk is the big thing. And I think that has to apply when you start talking about pharmacies and how they're handling it. And the other is you also worry about regulations. And it's, to me, relatively clean cut of where the break is between the FDA and OSHA.
And I think with that too, mentioning earlier on the HCS 2024, I know there is a more, this was always in the regulations, but it's being emphasized more in the update, is reasonable anticipated uses along the supply chain. And you and I have talked about that as well. This could be a part of that is like, how can you, especially for like commodity chemicals, right? Something that's going to be changed in many different ways, uses anticipated, unanticipated. What is going to, how do you, as manufacturer of that base chemical, commodity chemical, reasonably going to cover all thousands and thousands of plus uses? We asked this question to OSHA. OSHA said, we don't expect you to be, in essence, God and knowing all of this stuff at one time, but as a manufacturer, you should typically know over the years. They kind of alluded to the fact that we want you to give some communication and warn about that in your SDS. So again, going back to what I said, letters of interpretation, compliance guidance, that sort of thing. Be practical in what you're doing. They don't want you spending, umpteen hours in section 2 of the SDS covering every possible thousands of uses here. So great point, and I think that makes sense, especially in the world of pharmaceuticals. In that, and you talked a little bit earlier on about reporting hazards or reporting under-reporting or over-reporting, over-classification, under-classification. What do you feel are pitfalls here for that?
There are there are certain areas that kind of irritate me when I read a safety data sheet. I see things that are solids. I see things that are oil, and they have pH listed on them. I have not learned how to take a pH on an oil. I have not learned how to take a pH on a solid product. Now, if I have a product, I have powdered citric acid, and when I mix it at a certain concentration, I can get a pH. Fine. If I want to say that, when diluted at 10%, here's my pH. Fine, put that in there. But don't put that in there and it's kind of arbitrary. The You might see something about, let's go back to water. There's firefighting. Use dry chemical or CO2 fire extinguisher on it. I still haven't learned how to burn water. My father came close. He could not turn the stove on, but he almost could burn water. But I've never seen water catch on fire. And why do they have that in there? I have a client that says, yeah, we want to put that in there, use this because everybody does. I said, okay, it's not my recommendation. They're the ones ultimately responsible. You or I, who can author it, can give our recommendations, but it still comes down to the user. My latest one, I just sent this to you a day or two ago, that this is a new one on me. There was a kit, and it had an SDS for it. And the kit has, I don't know, 6, 8 components in it. And it said, all these sections refer to SDS for this product. And it's like, why do you even have a reference to another SDS that, just use that SDS? If,
Right.
I just could not understand that they were trying to come up with an SDS for a kit as opposed to the individual components. There's just so much in there. I see, we've had discussions where something was part deionized water and something else. Now, deionized water you cannot measure pH on. It is the definition of pH is measuring the ions. And I learned about this during wastewater sampling, and we had a lot of DI water, and the pH would go from 1 to 15. Yes, higher than 14. You can't get that. So, learned went back to basics. What is pH? You had we looked at something and they said, well, maybe that's what the issue is, and it wasn't, and found out it wasn't. They had a pH of 2 or 1.5, and they said it wasn't corrosive. You get it all over the place. That's why I say I like looking at the raw data that they have on this. And just another little aside that very few people know about, and I lecture on this all the time. Permissible exposure limit, the PEL, the threshold limit value, the TLV. What can a healthy adult be exposed to for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year for a lifetime of exposure without any known adverse side effects? Have I said that enough times in my life? Yes. This is not based on raw data. This is a group of people that make their best guess. That's why I like going back to the raw data to say how hazardous is something. And again, this comes back down to the confusion of safety data sheets.
And with that, speaking about the raw data, and in those cases where you run into that and you may question that, how do you deal with questioning the manufacturer or whoever authored that SDS where they came up with the data? Do you get into debates? Let's put it.
Oh, I never get into a debate. I usually win. It's the old adage, speak softly and carry a big stick, comes into play here. And I use the acronym PETA, pain in the, you can figure out the A. And I am considered one of the biggest PETAs when it comes down to safety data sheet, I think, in the industry. Uh, there, I have had an example where a company said, look, this product is hazardous, and it wasn't. And I said, you're making my clients have to wear all this stuff. Why are you calling it hazardous? Well, we think it might do this, that, or the other. I said, okay, then you have to ship it as hazardous. And that's going to cost you more money. And they come back and say, oh, let's change the SDS to reflect what it really is. So that was one where they made it more hazardous. There's the example we just said, a pH of 2 or 1.5. And it's like, you have to make it hazardous. And if you know what you're looking at, I talk to the manufacturer, the distributor, not often, maybe once every 2 years, every 3 years. But those are the conversations I have. And I'll call and say, I need to talk to someone knowledgeable about your SDS. And almost always they're readily willing to change. Very rarely will I say, okay, if you're not going to change, I will let OSHA or the state plan OSHA know what's going on, and then they change. I probably have had to use that line twice in the last 30 years. And
That's great.
so yes, I do talk to them when I know something's wrong, and I think that is the ethical thing to do.
That's great to hear because, again, not everyone would be like that. It's almost like accounting. Are you trying to get away with your taxes and underreporting or finding the loopholes that you can get away with? It's there like everything else with regulations. It's good to have a good tax advisor, and in our case, good EHS professionals that can, again, debate with you and get
That's why
you.
people come to you. They come to me.
Exactly. And they come to you. Exactly. So this is where the gray areas and the hope for this podcast and what we plan to do with this is get into those gray areas. And it's not always black and white like the regulations will have you believe. This is why I think it's great to talk to subject matter experts such as yourself. Being in the real world trenches, I think that's very helpful to anyone listening and paying attention out there. So, related to this, waste disposal instructions on SDSs. What do you find out there in the real world?
Well, I find them pretty much useless, to put it bluntly. But when it comes down to waste disposal, you and I both are part of the Alliance of Hazardous Material Professionals, and they align themselves with the Institute of Hazardous Material Managers, who are the keepers of the Certified Hazardous Material Manager (CHMM) designation. And when you have that designation, it is implied that you understand hazardous materials, and there's a lot of focus on hazardous waste. When you look at a component, when you look at a mixture, there are guidelines from EPA to tell you how to dispose of something. The safety data sheet, the waste disposal is an optional section. The generic line is follow all local and federal regulations. Good, that helps me a lot. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. And but it just comes down to get somebody that can make an informed decision based upon the information you have there. And I used to run a treatment, storage, and disposal facility and vowed I would never do EPA work again. And probably about 30% of my work is doing EPA and looking at waste and figuring out how do we dispose of it safely and legally. And I always put safe first before legal.
Excellent. So, in the role of the SDS, does it play any part in building design for architects that need to know how many different categories of hazardous materials are going to be stored in a facility? Where does an SDS come into that?
So, if you ever get into building design, there are different building classifications and how much of different hazardous materials you can store. A lot of people think about flammable, but the National Fire Protection Association and the International Building Codes and the International Fire Codes all have other classifications. And you can't arbitrarily just look at the safety data sheet and say, oh, it meets this classification or not. Just one example would be peroxides. And DHS has its own definition of peroxides and reactivity. But when you look at the IFC and the IBC, International Fire Code, International Building Code, they don't even match. And they're definitely different from OSHA's definition. So what do? I have to go back and look at data that's on the safety data sheet to give it a classification, because you have all these requirements for building code. You have what is considered extremely hazardous or hazardous from a health perspective in building code. You have to go back to the LD50. They could care less about the PEL or the TLV. And it's, I had a client that I had to do thousands of reviews of every SDS. It amazed me all the mistakes I found. But I'm looking at it for the building design, because they were taking a building that they were in for 50 years and moving to a new one. So, of course, everybody had every chemical they had back in 1937. And it's not a skill that everybody has. And it's one that most people don't even realize you have to do.
Thanks very much for that information. We don't always think about building buildings with what we do in our daily work on SDSs. So, with that, do you have any last comments as far as the SDS world goes and fighting in the trenches?
Well, I have a hard time with OSHA saying that you make SDSs readily available to employees so they know what the hazards are, when most safety professionals don't really understand SDSs. SDSs are a great resource, and if you understand them, you can be a great resource for somebody else. With SDSs, there are a lot of errors that you will find in there, and you need, as a safety professional, environmental health and safety professional, you need to know how to read these. And don't take them at face value. Look at them carefully and use them, because that's how we protect our employees, our friends, our coworkers, and even family members. So, over the years, I sort of fell into this, and it's been as many talks as I can give. I want people to understand the value and the limitations of safety data sheets, and I appreciate having this time to talk to you, who I consider a really world class expert in safety data sheets. And together, I think we make a great team. So,
I
thank you.
appreciate that. Yeah, this is why I had you on today. I think that more people need to have the word out, and this is why we do the things we do. For me, early on in my career, I was told, you want to have somebody come in with 10 fingers, 10 toes, and leave with 10 fingers, 10 toes, right? So it's a motto I apply throughout all I do in this profession, and I know you do the same. And again, thank you for have being
Well,
on the show today.
I will
And
make one slight change to your come in with 10 fingers, 10 toes. I say 10
oh,
fingers and 10 functional toes. I want them
there you
still to
go.
be functional.
Functional. That's a good point. That's a good point.
It
It's
is, I
not
can
enough
come
to just
out and
have
have
them.
my fingers and they might be burned, but I
I
want them in the same condition they went in to come out that way.
Yeah, I
So,
love that. That's a good point, and this is why we have compliance and the gray areas of compliance and what that means in the real world. So thank you again, Bruce. Pleasure having you on. Would look forward to hearing you again someday. Take care.
you have a great day. Thank you.